Have you ever wondered why you are facing so many difficulties? Have you ever felt like God is silent when you most need an answer? In this video, we will reveal how God speaks through the challenges you face and how each struggle can be preparing you for something much greater. God is not silent. He manifests himself in silence, in the closing of doors, in storms, and even in the people he puts in his path. If you've been searching for a sign, this could be the answer you've been waiting for. Have you ever felt like your prayers were hitting a wall, as if God was silent in the midst of your struggles? You cry out, you seek answers, but all you get is more questions, more uncertainty. Could it be that the very challenges you face are actually God's way of speaking to you? What if your trials are not obstacles but divine messages, guiding you toward something greater? Jesus often taught through parables, revealing deep spiritual truths in ways that required faith and discernment. He spoke of the mustard seed, of the lost sheep, of the wise builder, all symbols of endurance, faith, and God's perfect plan unfolding beyond human understanding. But what if his lessons are not just found in Scripture? What if they are woven into the fabric of your everyday struggles, hidden in the moments of disappointment, waiting to be uncovered through prayer and trust? Think about it. How many times in the Bible did God allow his people to go through trials before revealing his purpose? Joseph was betrayed, enslaved, and imprisoned before stepping into his destiny. Job lost everything before he encountered God in a way he never had before. Even Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed with such intensity that his sweat turned to blood. And yet, through every hardship, through every unanswered prayer, there was a divine purpose being fulfilled. Maybe the silence you're experiencing isn't rejection, it's preparation. Maybe the closed doors aren't punishment, they're protection. Maybe the very storm you're facing is the path to your breakthrough. But how can you recognize God's voice in the middle of the storm? How can you discern his message when all you feel is confusion and pain? Prayer is the key. Jesus repeatedly withdrew to pray, showing us that connection with the Father is where clarity is found. He taught his disciples, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you." Matthew 7:7. But what if the answer doesn't come in the way you expect? What if, instead of removing the struggle, God is using it to shape you, to refine your faith, to prepare you for something you cannot yet see? Many people think that when God is silent, he is absent. But in reality, his silence can be the loudest answer of all. Just as a teacher remains quiet during a test, God sometimes steps back, not to abandon you, but to see if you will trust him, even when you don't understand. This is where faith is tested. This is where your prayers become more than just words, they become surrender. And surrender is powerful. It's in surrender that miracles happen. It's in surrender that chains are broken. It's in surrender that God moves in ways beyond what you could ask or imagine. The Apostle Paul wrote, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Your struggles are not signs of God's absence. They are invitations to deeper faith, to relentless prayer, to trust that He is working even when you cannot see it. So, if you have been wondering why your prayers seem unanswered, if you have been wrestling with doubt, if you have been searching for a sign that God is still speaking, keep listening. Because right now, at this very moment, He may be revealing something to you that will change everything. If you've ever felt like God was distant, if you've been struggling to hear His voice through your challenges, know this: He has never left you. He is speaking even now through every trial, every delay, every unanswered prayer. But are you listening? Are you seeking Him, not just for solutions, but for a deeper relationship? That's why prayer is so powerful. Prayer is not just about asking, it's about aligning. It's about stepping into God's presence, surrendering your worries and allowing His peace to fill you. Jesus Himself showed us that prayer is where strength is found. Before performing miracles, before facing the cross, He prayed. In moments of exhaustion, He withdrew to be with the Father. If Jesus needed prayer, how much more do we? And right now we're going to pray together. But before we do, I want to invite you to take a step of faith. Drop your prayer request in the comments. Whatever you're going through, you are not alone. This is a space where we stand in faith together, where we intercede for one another, where we believe that God is still moving. Whether it's healing, direction, breakthrough, or simply the strength to keep going, let us know and let's lift it up in prayer. And if this message is speaking to your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button so more people can find this word. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what God has for you next. Because this journey of faith is not meant to be walked alone. We are in this together. Now, let's pray. Have you ever felt like your prayers were being spoken into an empty void, as if every plea, every whispered cry for help was met with silence? You kneel in desperation, seeking answers, longing for a sign, but instead, you're greeted with nothing but uncertainty. And in that silence, doubt creeps in. Has God abandoned me? Is He even listening? But what if I told you that this silence is not absence but a message, one so powerful, so transformative, that only those who truly seek Him will understand? What if God's quietness in your life is the loudest He has ever spoken? Throughout the Bible, God has remained silent before He revealed something great. Before the flood, before the Exodus, before the resurrection, there was silence. The Israelites endured 400 years without a single prophet before Jesus came. Even on the cross, Jesus Himself cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But was He forsaken? No. It was in that moment that the greatest act of salvation was unfolding. What if your silence is the same? What if your struggles, your unanswered prayers, your waiting, what if they are the very proof that something divine is happening behind the scenes? Think about it. A teacher does not speak during a test. And God, the ultimate teacher, sometimes steps back, not to abandon you, but to see if you will hold on to faith when nothing makes sense. Will you still trust him when doors slam shut in your face? Will you still pray when every situation tells you it's useless? This is where faith is refined. This is where the weak fall away, and those who are truly seeking God find him in a way they never imagined. There's a reason why Jesus often withdrew to pray in solitude. He understood something that many overlook. Silence is not empty. It is full of divine whispers. But the world is loud, and we expect God's voice to be louder, more obvious, more direct. We want fire from the sky, parting seas, or a voice thundering through the clouds. But God doesn't always work that way, remember Elijah? He expected God in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire. But God wasn't in any of those. Instead, he came in a still, small voice. That's the mystery. That's the revelation. God speaks, but not always the way you expect. The real question is, are you listening, or are you too busy complaining about the silence? What if, instead of saying, God, why aren't you speaking? You started asking, God, what are you teaching me in this silence? That shift in perspective could be the key to unlocking the answer you've been waiting for. Now, let's take this deeper. Why does God allow these moments of silence? Why does he let us feel alone when he could easily show up and remove all doubt? Because faith is built in the unseen. If God showed up instantly every time you faced a challenge, where would trust come in? If every prayer was answered the moment it was spoken, would you still seek him, or would you only seek the things he gives? Look at Joseph, betrayed, sold into slavery, imprisoned. Years passed, and he must have wondered if God had forgotten him. But every moment, every hardship was part of a divine setup. The silence wasn't punishment, it was positioning. And when the time was right, God's voice wasn't silent anymore. He spoke through Joseph's elevation to power, through the very people who betrayed him bowing at his feet. What if your silence is a setup for something greater? God doesn't just work through words. He works through circumstances, through divine appointments, through inner convictions. Have you ever had a door shut in your face only to realize later that it was for your protection? Have you ever looked back at a painful moment and seen God's fingerprints all over it? That's how he speaks. And sometimes, the silence is where he is doing his greatest work. But here's the challenge. Can you trust him in the silence? Can you believe that even when you can't hear him, he is still working? Because this is the test. This is the moment where faith either grows or withers. And the ones who hold on, the ones who pray even when there's no answer, the ones who stay faithful even when they feel forgotten, those are the ones who will see the hand of God move in ways they never imagined. So, if you're in a season of silence, don't run. Don't let doubt steal your faith. Lean in. Pray harder. Seek deeper. Because God's silence is not rejection. It's preparation. And if you're willing to trust him in this, you may just discover that he has been speaking all along. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a time when God felt silent but later you realized he was working? Share your story. I want to hear how God has moved in your life, even in the moments when it felt like he wasn't there. If this word is speaking to your heart, type "I trust you, God" in the comments right now. Let's declare together that we will trust him, even in the silence. Mystery and reflection. Sometimes the greatest revelations come not in moments of clarity, but in moments of confusion. You pray for direction, and instead you are met with roadblocks. You ask for peace, and suddenly, your life seems to spiral into chaos. You cry out for answers, but all you hear is silence. And in that silence, doubt whispers its familiar lies. Maybe God isn't listening. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe I'm alone in this. But what if I told you that the very confusion you're feeling right now is the evidence that God is doing something bigger than you can comprehend? What if the roadblocks, the delays, the seemingly unanswered prayers are not a sign of abandonment, but a sign that you are being positioned for something greater? Think about the story of Lazarus. His sisters sent word to Jesus, pleading with him to come quickly because their brother was dying. They had seen his power before. They knew he had the ability to heal with just a word. And yet Jesus waited. He delayed. He did not rush to their rescue. From their perspective, it must have felt like God was ignoring them, like their prayers were falling on deaf ears. But what they couldn't see was that a greater miracle was unfolding. Jesus wasn't going to heal Lazarus. He was going to raise him from the dead. The delay wasn't a denial. It was the setup for something beyond their wildest imagination. And maybe that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. Maybe what feels like rejection is actually redirection. Maybe the silence is not God ignoring you, but God preparing you. Because if he answered your prayer exactly when and how you expected, you would never grow. You would never develop the patience, the trust, the depth of faith that is required for the next level he is leading you to. We want God to work in ways that make sense to us, but he operates outside of human logic. His ways are higher. His thoughts are beyond ours. And sometimes that means he will lead you through confusion, through uncertainty, through seasons where nothing seems to make sense, because only in those moments will you truly learn to walk by faith and not by sight. But here's the real test. Will you trust him when the path isn't clear? Will you keep praying when nothing is changing? Will you keep believing even when it seems like every door is closing? That's where real faith is built. Not when everything is easy, not when every prayer is answered immediately, but when you are standing in the middle of uncertainty, with no sign of breakthrough in sight, and yet you still choose to say, God, I trust you. That is the faith that moves mountains. That is the faith that shifts atmospheres. And here's the thing, God is not just testing your patience, he is testing your posture. Are you waiting with expectation, or are you waiting with frustration? Are you seeking him in the process, or are you just waiting for the process to be over? Because how you wait matters just as much as what you're waiting for. If you are in a season of uncertainty right now, don't just sit in frustration. Press in. Go deeper in prayer. Worship even when you don't feel like it. Declare his promises even when your circumstances say otherwise. Because what you do in the waiting will determine what happens when the breakthrough comes. And make no mistake, breakthrough is coming. But it will come in His timing, in His way, and for His glory. The longer the wait, the greater the testimony. The harder the battle, the sweeter the victory. But you can't give up now. You can't let the confusion shake you. You can't let the silence convince you that God is not working. Because what you see is not all that is happening. Behind the scenes in the spiritual realm, things are shifting. Doors are aligning. Divine appointments are being scheduled. Miracles are being prepared. But if you quit now, you'll never see them. If you stop trusting now, you'll never get to the other side of this. And I promise you, when you finally see what God was doing all along, you will look back at this moment and realize that the confusion, the struggle, the silence, was never the absence of God. It was the very proof of His presence. So don't let go. Keep praying. Keep seeking. Keep standing. Even if all you can say is, God, I don't understand, but I choose to trust you. Even if you don't see the way forward, choose to believe that He is making a way. Even if you feel like you have nothing left, hold on to the promise that He is working all things together for your good. Because one day, what doesn't make sense now will be the very testimony that encourages someone else to keep going. If this word is speaking to you, I want you to declare it in the comments. Type, I trust you, God, if you choose to believe that He is working, even when you can't see it. And if you've ever been through a season where God was silent but later revealed His plan, share your story below. Let's build each other up in faith, because someone else might need to hear exactly what you've been through to remind them that they are not alone. There's something deeply mysterious about how God operates. He moves in ways we don't expect, answers prayers in ways we don't understand, and sometimes He seems to be silent when we need Him the most. But if we look at Scripture, we see a pattern. God is always working, always speaking, always guiding, even when it feels like He isn't. The Bible is filled with moments where God's people faced silence, confusion, and delays, only to later realize that His plan was unfolding in ways they never could have predicted. And if He did it for them, why wouldn't He be doing the same for you right now? Look at Moses. For 40 years he lived in Pharaoh's palace, believing he was meant for something great. Then suddenly, his entire life changed in an instant. He fled Egypt, lost everything, and spent another 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. Can you imagine what was going through his mind? He must have questioned everything. God, did I miss my purpose? Why did you allow this to happen? But what he couldn't see was that those silent years, those years of obscurity, were preparation. God wasn't ignoring him. He was refining him. And when the time was right, God spoke through a burning bush and Moses' real calling began. The delays, the waiting, the seemingly wasted years were not wasted at all. They were necessary. And maybe that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. Then there's Joseph, a man who had a dream so clear, so vivid that he knew it was from God. He saw himself ruling, standing in a position of authority. And what happened next? Betrayal, slavery, false accusations, prison. Everything in his life seemed to contradict the promise God had given him, but what he didn't know was that every step, every hardship, was moving him closer to his destiny. Had he not been thrown into the pit, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. Had he not been sold into slavery, he wouldn't have entered Potiphar's house. Had he not been falsely accused, he wouldn't have gone to prison. And had he not been in prison, he wouldn't have met the cupbearer, who would later introduce him to Pharaoh. Every delay was divine, every setback was a setup, and in one moment, after years of what must have felt like silence, God spoke through Pharaoh's dream, and Joseph went from prisoner to ruler in a single day. We see this again with David. Anointed as king when he was just a boy, but what happened after? Did he immediately take the throne? No. He went back to tending sheep. Then, he found himself fighting battles, running for his life, hiding in caves, living as a fugitive. Year after year passed, and the promise of kingship seemed further away than ever. But all of that was preparation. God was shaping him, testing him, refining him until he was ready. And when the time came, David stepped into his destiny, not a second too soon, not a second too late. And then, of course, there's Jesus, the Son of God, born into this world with a purpose greater than anything we could ever imagine. But even he went through a season of waiting. For 30 years he lived in obscurity. The Savior of the world, yet he worked as a carpenter, walked among ordinary people, and waited. And when he finally stepped into his calling, what happened? He was rejected, misunderstood, falsely accused, and ultimately crucified. The disciples must have been devastated. How could this be God's plan? How could this be the way the story ends? But they didn't see what was happening behind the scenes. They didn't know that the silence of the tomb was just the setup for the greatest victory of all time. Because 3 days later the silence was shattered, and the resurrection changed everything. And now we come to you, your life, your struggles, your waiting. Do you see the pattern? Do you see what God has always done throughout history? He is always working in the waiting. He is always speaking through the silence. The fact that you don't see it right now doesn't mean it's not happening. If he allowed Moses to wait, Joseph to endure, David to struggle, and even Jesus to walk through suffering before stepping into victory, why would it be any different for you? What if, right now, the thing that feels like your biggest delay is actually the process that is moving you closer to your breakthrough? What if the silence is not a punishment, but preparation? What if everything that seems like it's falling apart is actually falling into place? You might not see it yet. You might not understand it now. But one day, you will look back and realize that God was speaking the entire time. And this is where faith comes in. Not faith when everything is going right. Not faith when prayers are answered instantly, but faith in the middle of uncertainty. Faith that chooses to believe, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Faith that stands firm, even when everything else is shaking. That is the faith that moves mountains. That is the faith that brings breakthroughs. That is the faith that God honors. If this word is resonating with you, let me know in the comments. Type, "I believe in God's timing," if you choose to trust that His delays are not denials. And if you've been through a season where you questioned everything, but later realized God was working all along, share your testimony. Your story could be the encouragement someone else needs to hold on a little longer. The importance of faith in God's silence. Faith is easy when everything is going well. When prayers are answered quickly, when doors open effortlessly, when life unfolds exactly as you imagined, it's not difficult to believe that God is with you. But what about when He is silent? What about when you pray and nothing changes? What about when you are standing at a crossroads desperately seeking direction, and all you are met with is uncertainty? That is where real faith is tested, not in the moments of clarity, but in the moments of silence. Because faith is not about seeing, it's about trusting. And trusting God when everything around you is screaming that He is absent is one of the hardest things a believer will ever have to do. It's human nature to want immediate answers. We live in a world of instant gratification, where everything is available at the touch of a button. We expect the same from God. We pray and assume that if He doesn't respond right away, then He must not be listening. But God does not operate on human timelines. He exists outside of time itself, and while we are focused on the now, He is orchestrating something far greater, something that stretches beyond what we can comprehend. His silence is not a sign of neglect. It is an invitation to deeper faith. Because if you can trust Him in the silence, you are proving that your faith is not based on circumstances, but on who He is. Look at Abraham. God promised him a son, yet he waited decades for that promise to come to pass. Imagine the nights of doubt, the days of questioning, the moments when he wondered if he had misunderstood God. But he chose to believe, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. And because of his faith, he became the father of nations. The delay was not denial. The silence was not rejection. It was preparation for something so much greater than he could have imagined. And then there's Noah. God told him to build an ark, but imagine the ridicule he must have endured as the years passed and no flood came. People probably mocked him, called him crazy, doubted that he had truly heard from God. But Noah kept building. He kept trusting. And when the rain finally came, he and his family were saved, while those who doubted perished. His faith in the silence, his willingness to trust God even when nothing seemed to be happening, was the very thing that preserved him. Maybe you are in that place right now. Maybe you feel like you are building something in obedience to God, yet nothing seems to be changing. Maybe you have prayed for a breakthrough, but all you hear is silence. Maybe you are watching others receive their blessings while you are still waiting, wondering if you were forgotten. But let me tell you, God has not forgotten you. He has not ignored your prayers. He has not abandoned you in the waiting. He is moving in ways you cannot see, working behind the scenes, aligning things in your favor. And when the time is right, everything will fall into place. But here's the question. Will you trust him in the silence? Will you keep believing, even when the answer is delayed? Will you hold on to his promises, even when the evidence suggests otherwise? That is what separates those who truly walk by faith from those who only believe when things are easy. Faith is not just about believing in God's power. It is about trusting his timing. It is about understanding that just because you don't see him moving doesn't mean he isn't. Just because he is quiet doesn't mean he isn't speaking. Sometimes his greatest work happens in the moments when we feel the most forgotten. Think about a seed buried in the ground. It looks like nothing is happening. There is no visible progress, no immediate sign of growth. But beneath the surface, things are shifting. Roots are forming. Foundations are being laid. And at just the right time, that seed will break through the soil and become something beautiful. But if you dig it up too soon, if you walk away in frustration because you don't see results, you will never witness the harvest. Some of you are in that exact place. You are in the soil. You feel buried, hidden, forgotten. But you are not. God is cultivating something in you, strengthening your roots, preparing you for what is coming. The worst thing you can do is give up before the breakthrough. And this is why faith is so critical in the silence. Because the enemy will use those moments to plant doubt, to make you question if God is really with you. He will try to convince you that your prayers are wasted, that your waiting is pointless, that God has moved on to bless someone else while leaving you behind. But those are lies. Lies designed to shake your faith, to make you give up just before your miracle comes. The Bible tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God. Not faith when things are easy, not faith when everything makes sense, but faith when nothing makes sense. Faith when all you have is a promise and silence. That kind of faith is powerful. That kind of faith moves heaven. So let me ask you, are you willing to trust him, even in the silence? Are you willing to keep building, keep believing, keep praying, even when there is no sign of change? Because that is the kind of faith that produces miracles. That is the kind of faith that shifts atmospheres. That is the kind of faith that sees the impossible become possible. If this message is speaking to you, if you are in a season where God feels silent, I want you to declare it in the comments. Type, "I trust you, God," as an act of faith. Let this be your declaration that no matter what you feel, no matter what you see, you choose to believe that he is still working. And if you have ever experienced a moment where you thought God was silent, only to later realize he was working all along, share your story in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it. Because faith is not just about what we receive. It's about what we pass on to encourage others. The power of prayer as a divine connection. There are times when words seem insufficient. You bend your knees, close your eyes, try to formulate a prayer, but all you can feel is a crushing weight on your soul. Doubts scream louder than your faith. God's silence seems deafening and the feeling of being alone becomes almost unbearable. But what you may not realize is that this may be exactly the time when your prayer has the most power. Prayer is not just a cry for help. It is not a monologue thrown into the wind, waiting for an answer. Prayer is an alignment, a direct connection with the Creator, a deep dive into the presence of the One who has absolute control over all things. We often think that prayer is just a way of asking God for something. We ask for healing, for direction, for answers, for immediate solutions. But what if prayer is much more than that? What if prayer is not just about changing our circumstances, but about changing ourselves? Jesus taught us to pray not to mold God to our desires, but to mold ourselves to His will. In Gethsemane, about to face the cross, He did not cry out to escape suffering. Instead, He said, "Father, not my will, but yours be done." This is the true power of prayer. She not only moves mountains, but transforms hearts. Prayer puts us before God in a way that nothing else can. The moment you kneel, the moment you raise your voice, something begins to change. You may not realize it immediately. You may not feel something supernatural happening around you, but spiritually, there is a movement. The enemy trembles before a Christian who prays with faith. The heavens open to those who learn to trust, not because the answer comes quickly, but because they know that God is listening. How many times in the Bible do we see stories of people who received miraculous answers after praying fervently? Hannah prayed for a son, and God gave her Samuel. Elijah prayed, and fire came down from heaven. Paul and Silas prayed in prison, and the chains were broken. What do all these stories have in common? None of them had immediate answers. There was waiting. There was perseverance. There was faith. And this is where many give up, because they believe that praying without an answer means that God is not listening. But what if God is working while you wait? What if the delay in responding is part of the preparation? When you pray, you are not just talking, you are fighting a spiritual battle. There is an invisible world operating around you. Remember the story of Daniel? He prayed for 21 days before his answer came, and when the angel finally appeared, he told him that from day one, God had already heard his prayer. But there was a war in the spiritual realm that prevented the answer from arriving any faster. Now think about this. How many times have you given up praying because you thought God was taking time? What if the answer was on the way, but the spiritual battle required you to continue in prayer? What happens when you pray is not just an external change, but an internal one. Your heart begins to align with God's purposes, your mind begins to be renewed, your confidence begins to grow. Praying is not just about what you can receive, but about who you are becoming in the process. God doesn't just want to give you blessings, He wants to prepare you to receive them. Because what's the point of God opening doors if you're not ready to walk through them? What's the point of Him delivering promises if your faith is not yet mature enough to hold them? Prayer strengthens your resistance. Many people pray once or twice and, If nothing happens, they simply give up. But those who really experience the move of God are those who persist, who continue even when they don't feel anything, even when they don't see changes, even when everything seems stagnant. Because prayer is not emotion, it is commitment. And those who commit to seeking God regardless of the circumstances are those who see His glory being manifested. If you feel like your prayer is weak, that your words don't make sense, that it seems like God isn't listening, keep going. Even when you don't understand, keep going. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, keep going. Because God listens. He sees every tear. He understands every sigh. And at the right time, the answer will come. But until then, prayer will sustain you. She will be your strength when you feel weak. She will be your light when everything seems dark. She will be your bridge when you don't know where to go. If this word spoke to your heart, if you feel that God is calling you to a deeper level of prayer, I want you to write in the comments, I choose to trust. Declare it, write it, make it a reality in your life. Because prayer is not a last resort, it is your greatest weapon. And those who use it with faith will never be defeated. When God's silence tests your faith, there are times when God's only response is silence. You pray, you seek, you cry out with all your might, but all you receive is absolute emptiness. No sign, no direction, no immediate relief. And doubt begins to whisper, does God really hear me? Does He care? Am I praying wrong? God's silence can be disconcerting because we are conditioned to believe that the absence of response means the absence of care. But what few understand is that God's silence is not a sign that He is not listening. It's a test to see if you will continue to trust Him, even when you don't understand. When God is silent, it does not mean He is not working. In fact, some of the greatest miracles begin in the midst of apparent inaction. Look at Job's life. He was a righteous man, upright, faithful to God, but suddenly he lost everything: his possessions, his family, his health. And the most painful? God was silent. Job cried out, questioned, sought answers. But the sky seemed closed. What he didn't know was that his story wasn't just about him, but about something much bigger, something that was happening in the spiritual world. The enemy wanted to destroy him, but God was allowing that test because He knew Job would emerge stronger, more resilient and more blessed than before. God's silence was not a punishment. It was a battlefield where Job's faith was being tested. And what about Abraham? God promised him a son, but years passed and nothing happened. Time seemed to be the enemy of promise. Each day that passed without a sign of fulfillment was an opportunity for doubt to grow. But Abraham remained steadfast. He chose to believe, even when everything around him screamed that it was impossible. And when God finally spoke again, when the silence was broken, the promise was fulfilled. But only after Abraham learned to trust not in the speed of the response, but in the faithfulness of the one who made the promise. This is the true test of faith. Do you still believe when God doesn't speak? Do you keep praying when it seems like nothing changes? Do you stand firm or give up because you think He isn't listening? Many miss their miracles because they mistake God's silence for God's rejection. But if you look at the scriptures, you will see that there is almost always a period of silence before a great move of God. Before the flood, there was silence. Before the Exodus, there were 400 years of silence. Before the resurrection, there were 3 days of darkness and despair. But in each of these situations, God was not absent. He was preparing something extraordinary. God's silence may be preparing you for something you can't yet see. Maybe He is strengthening your faith, teaching you to trust beyond your circumstances. Perhaps He is molding your character, removing from your life everything that could prevent you from receiving the answer at the right time. Maybe He is aligning situations around you, preparing connections, opening paths that you can't even imagine. But if you give up now, if you let silence kill your faith, you will never see what He is preparing. Many Christians think that faith means always feeling something. But faith has nothing to do with feelings, it's about conviction. If you only believe when you see it, then your faith has not yet matured. But when you choose to believe even when everything seems contrary, that is true trust in God. This is what moves mountains. This is what brings supernatural answers. God does not want a faith that depends on emotions. He wants a faith that remains unshakable, even in the midst of silence. Think about it. What if God's silence is an invitation for you to go deeper? What if He is waiting to see if you will look to Him not just for answers, but for who He is? Jesus faced this test. When He was on the cross in His most difficult moment, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The Son of God Himself experienced the sensation of divine silence. But still, He trusted. He committed His spirit into the hands of the Father, knowing that the story did not end there. And 3 days later, the silence was broken by humanity's greatest victory. Maybe you've been waiting months, years, maybe even decades for something God has promised. And perhaps, during this time of waiting, you felt a suffocating silence. But what if what you see as a delay is actually a process? What if this quiet time is strengthening your faith so that when the answer comes, you are prepared to receive it? What God wants to do in your life may be too big to happen all at once. He may be teaching you patience, endurance, absolute trust. Silence does not mean oblivion. It means preparation. If you feel that God is silent in your life, don't lose faith. Keep praying, keep seeking, keep trusting. Because today's silence can be the prelude to tomorrow's miracle. And when that silence is finally broken, you will see that God has been working all along. If this word spoke to you, I want you to write in the comments, "I trust in God, even in silence." Declare this, make this sentence a commitment of faith. Because those who choose to trust even without answers are those who will experience God's move the most. Closed doors as divine protection. How many times have you felt frustrated because something you really wanted just didn't happen? You prayed, you planned, you tried, but in the end, the door closed before your eyes. Maybe it was an opportunity that seemed perfect, a relationship that seemed promising, a path that made perfect sense for you, but suddenly everything fell apart. And the question that arises deep in the soul is always the same. Why? Why did God allow this door to close? Why didn't he remove the obstacles? Why didn't he make the path easier? But what if I told you that that closed door was, in fact, the greatest protection God could have given you? What if what seemed like a failure was, in reality, a detour into something much greater? The Bible is full of examples of people who tried to follow one path, and, in the middle of the journey, God intervened. And led them in another direction. The Apostle Paul is one of the greatest examples of this. He wanted to preach in Asia. He was determined to take the gospel to that region, but the Bible says that the Holy Spirit prevented him from going. Imagine the frustration. He was doing something good, something for God, but the door just closed. What Paul didn't know at that moment was that God was directing his steps elsewhere. And because of this change of route, he ended up taking the gospel to Europe, starting a movement that would impact the entire world. What seemed like a disappointment was, in fact, a much bigger plan being executed. And how many times has this happened in your life? You look back and realize that that door that closed was the best thing that could have happened. Maybe you lost a job you thought was perfect, only to later find an even better opportunity. Maybe you were rejected by someone you loved, but later realized that person would never have led you to your true purpose. Maybe you insisted on something that seemed right, but that, in the end, would have led to your destruction if God hadn't stopped you. The problem is that, at the time, we can't see it that way. We only feel the pain, the frustration, the feeling that God did not answer our prayer. But what if he was protecting you from something you would never know how to face? God sees what you don't see. He knows what's around the next bend. He sees the danger that you cannot perceive. And many times, he allows doors to close not to punish you, but to keep you. You may be praying for something and not understand why it isn't happening, but what you don't know is that God is freeing you from a trap, from suffering, from a weight that you don't need to carry. And do you know what is the biggest mistake that many people make? They try to force doors that God has already closed. They insist on paths that are not for them. They try to revive what should have already been left behind. And, in this attempt to go against God's will, they end up hurting themselves even more. Remember Jonah. God had a plan for him, but he decided to go in the opposite direction. He took a boat and tried to escape the call. But God sent a storm. The door that Jonas wanted to keep open began to close in front of him, and only after being thrown into the sea, swallowed by a large fish and spending 3 days in the belly of that animal, did he finally understand that he needed to stop fighting against God's will. Sometimes the doors that close are storms sent to stop us from going down the wrong path. They are warnings that we are going in the wrong direction. But the problem is that we often become so focused on what we want that we fail to see the deliverance in front of us. God never closes a door without having a purpose. If He is stopping you from following a path, it is because He has something better. And that best may not make sense now. It may seem unfair. It may seem painful. But one day, you will look back and understand. How many stories have you heard of people who, after years, realized that what seemed like a failure was actually the best thing that could have happened? The problem is that we want to understand everything as it happens, but God asks us to trust Him before we see the whole picture. He asks us to believe that if a door has closed, it is because He has a new one to open. Maybe now you're frustrated because something you really wanted didn't work out. Maybe you are questioning God, trying to find answers. But I want you to do something different. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" ask, "What does the Lord want to teach me with this?" Instead of getting hung up on what has been lost, look ahead and wait for what God has in store. Because if He closed a door, it is because there is something greater waiting for you. If this word spoke to you, if you have ever experienced moments when you saw doors closing and then understood that it was God's deliverance, share your experience in the comments. Write, "I trust in God's plans," to declare that you will no longer insist on doors that He has already closed. Your testimony may help someone who is struggling to understand what God is doing now. Unexpected challenges as preparation. Sometimes life hits us with a force we can't understand. Everything seemed to be going well. You felt like you were on the right path, but suddenly an unexpected storm appears and changes everything. A diagnosis you didn't expect, a loss you didn't see coming, a door that closed without warning. And at that moment, everything inside you wants to scream, "Why? What did I do wrong? God, where are you?" But what if this challenge is not a punishment, but a training? What if, instead of being a sign that God has abandoned you, it is proof that He is preparing you for something greater? The truth is that God never calls someone to a purpose without first strengthening them. And the way He does this often surprises us. He allows us to face challenges not to destroy us, but to shape us. When we look at the great men and women of the Bible, we see a pattern. Before the promise, there is always the process. Before lifting, there always comes preparation. Joseph had a dream where he saw his future of greatness. But before he got there, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unfairly accused and thrown into prison. Moses was called to free the people of Israel, but before that, he spent 40 years in the desert, far from everything he knew. David was anointed king, but before sitting on the throne, he had to flee, hide, face battles that tested his faith. None of them just woke up one day and walked into their destiny. Each of them went through a process that seemed contrary to the promise God had made. But this process was not a sign that God had changed his mind. It was proof that he was preparing them for what was to come. The problem is that, at the time, we can't see this. We only see the pain, the frustration, the delay. We only feel the weight of the challenge and the desire to give up. We want God to lead us directly to our purpose without the hard part, without the tests, without the pain. But if he did that, we wouldn't be ready. Would you trust a soldier who has never been through training? Would you get into a plane piloted by someone who has never faced a flight test? God trains us through battles because he knows that without them, we would not be prepared to sustain what he wants to give us. Which means if you're facing a challenge right now, it's not because God has abandoned you. It's because he's at your side, teaching you, shaping you, preparing you. And the day victory comes, you won't be the same person you were when it all started. You will be stronger, wiser, more steadfast in faith. Because the fire that burns some is the same fire that purifies those who choose to trust. So if you're going through something you don't understand, if you feel like your life has been turned upside down and you don't know where to go anymore, take a deep breath and trust. Because if God allowed this fight, it is because He knows that you will come out of it more prepared for what He has for you. The challenge may seem great, but your God is greater. The storm may be strong, but He who calms the wind and the sea is in your boat. You may not understand now, but one day you will look back and see that it was exactly this phase that prepared you for the blessing that was to come. If this word spoke to you, I want you to declare in the comments, "This challenge is my preparation." Write this as a leap of faith, as a commitment that you won't give up halfway through the process. And if you've ever been through a difficult time that later turned out to be a time of growth, share your story in the comments. Someone may need to read exactly what you have to say. Divine appointments and people sent by God. Nothing in your life happens by chance. Every encounter, every connection, every person that crosses your path may have a purpose that you don't yet understand. We often look for grand signs, we wait for God to speak through spectacular miracles, but we ignore that He also uses people to guide us. God strategically places people on our journey, some to teach us, some to challenge us, some to support us, and even some to test us. But the problem is that we are often so focused on our struggles that we don't realize that God's answer may be in someone around us. Think about Moses. When he received the call to free the people of Israel, his first reaction was fear. He questioned God, said he didn't know how to speak well, that he wasn't qualified for this mission. But God had already prepared someone to help him. Aaron was sent to be your voice, to be by your side, to strengthen your path. Moses alone might not have been able to do it, but God never called him to walk alone. This shows us something powerful. When God gives us a purpose, He also puts the right people in our path so we can fulfill it. And what about Ruth? She lost everything, became a widow, and decided to follow her mother-in-law Naomi, without knowing what the future held for her. But God had already prepared a divine encounter. He put Boaz in her path, a man who would not only help her, but who would completely change her story. What seemed like a journey of suffering ended up becoming the beginning of something extraordinary. Ruth's life was transformed because she was in the right place, at the right time, and met the person God had already prepared to guide her. This happens all the time in our lives. Have you ever met someone who showed up at the exact moment you needed help? Have you ever received advice that changed your direction? Have you ever felt like someone was placed in your life with a specific purpose? This is no coincidence. It's God working behind the scenes, leading you through connections you didn't even realize were answers to your prayers. The problem is that we are often so focused on what we want that we don't value what God has already placed around us. We wait for blessings to come in a specific way and ignore the signs that are already in front of us. God can send people to open doors that you could never open on your own. It may put someone in your path to teach you something you need to learn before moving forward. You can even use strangers to give you words of wisdom in times of confusion. But we also need to be aware, because not every connection comes from God. Just as he sends people to bless you, the enemy can also try to place people to distract you, divert you from your purpose, weaken you spiritually. Therefore, discernment is essential. Not every open door is a divine door. Not all friendship is a gift from God. Some connections come to test your faith to reveal where your true confidence lies. Paul found Timothy and trained him to be a powerful leader in the kingdom. But he also had to deal with Judas, someone who was close to Jesus but whose heart was not aligned with God's will. And here's the big lesson. The connections that God brings into your life push you closer to Him, while those that don't come from Him take you away from your purpose. This is why we need to pray for discernment, to understand who has been sent to walk alongside us and who has been sent to distract us. And maybe today you are praying for answers, looking for a sign, waiting for God to show you what to do. But have you ever paid attention to the people He has placed around you? Isn't the answer already in advice someone gave you, in a door someone tried to open for you, in a friendship that emerged unexpectedly? God works through relationships, and ignoring this could be missing opportunities that were prepared especially for you. If you feel like you are alone, that there is no one to help you, remember this. God always puts the right people in your path at the right time. But often, these people don't come the way we expect. They can emerge as mentors, as friends, as spiritual leaders, even as strangers who appear with a word at just the right moment. God doesn't just need to use visible miracles to speak to you. It can use something as simple as a conversation, a connection, a seemingly random encounter. If this word spoke to your heart, I want you to declare in the comments, Lord, give me discernment to recognize the connections that come from you. And if you've ever had a divine encounter, a connection that changed your life, share your experience in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to recognize that God is also moving people around him. Peace in the storm is a confirmation. There are moments in life when everything around us seems to be falling apart. You feel like you're in the middle of a storm, not knowing where to go, not seeing a way out, surrounded by chaos and uncertainty. And at that moment, logic says you should be desperate, anxious, gripped by fear. But somehow there's a peace inside you that doesn't make sense. It's as if in the middle of the wind, in the middle of the confusion, there was a deep silence in your soul, an inexplicable certainty that everything will work out, even when all the circumstances say otherwise. This peace is one of the greatest signs that God is in control. The Bible shows us one of the most intense moments in which this happened. The disciples were on the boat when a violent storm arose at sea. The waves were so strong that they feared for their lives. And where was Jesus? Sleeping. While everyone was terrified, screaming, trying to save the boat from destruction, Jesus rested, because he knew that the storm did not have the power to sink something that was under God's protection. But the disciples had not yet understood this. They ran to him desperate, asking if he didn't care that they were about to die. And Jesus, with all the calm in the world, stood up, looked at the wind and the sea, and said, "Be still." And instantly, there was peace. This story teaches us something powerful. The storm was not a sign that Jesus had abandoned them. His silence did not mean he was not in control. The presence of the storm did not mean they were on the wrong path. This was all part of the process of learning. And the real lesson was not in the miracle that calmed the sea, but in the fact that, even before that, Jesus was already at peace. He didn't need to see the storm subside to know he was safe. He already knew he was. And it is exactly this level of trust that God wants to build in us. We often ask for confirmation from God. We want visible signs, tangible proof that we are on the right path. But the most powerful confirmation we can receive is not in what we see around us, but in what we feel within ourselves. If you are faced with an important decision, if you are facing a challenge, if you don't know which direction to follow, the peace of God may be the answer you are looking for, because this peace goes beyond logic, beyond circumstances, beyond what the world can understand. It does not depend on what is happening around, but rather on who is in control. Have you ever gone through a moment when, in the natural sense, everything seemed wrong, but within you there was an unshakable certainty that everything would be okay? This is no coincidence. This is not empty optimism. This is God telling you, "I'm here. Keep going. I'm in control." This peace is a divine gift, something the world cannot offer. Jesus said, "My peace I give to you, not as the world gives." This means that God's peace is not fragile, it is not based on circumstances, it is not fleeting. It remains even when everything is in chaos. But what if you don't feel that peace? What if, instead, there is a heaviness, a restlessness, a discomfort that you can't explain? This could also be a sign, because just as God confirms something through peace, He can also warn us through the lack of it. How many times have you had a feeling that something wasn't right, even without an apparent reason? Something inside you told you not to move forward, to wait, to seek more direction. And later, did you realize that if you had ignored that warning, you would have fallen into a trap? God speaks in many ways, and one of them is through what we feel within us. If you're forcing something and still can't feel peace, maybe it's a sign that God is trying to show you something. Maybe He is protecting you from a path that seems good, but is not best for you. Maybe He is waiting for you to stop and seek Him before moving forward. Many people's mistake is to ignore this sign, to rush ahead, to move forward even if they feel that something is not right. But the consequences of this could be great. The problem is that we often let our emotions and anxiety speak louder. We want something to happen so much that we try to ignore how we feel. But the truth is that the peace of God never deceives. If you need to convince yourself that something is right, it probably isn't. If you constantly struggle with a feeling of restlessness, perhaps God is trying to tell you to wait, to trust, to take your time. And that is why we need to learn to recognize this peace as a sign, We need to understand that God's answer will not always come in audible words, nor will it always come through a dream or a visible sign. Sometimes He just places that assurance within us, and other times He warns us with a heavy heart that we cannot ignore. The secret is to stop looking for answers only externally and start paying attention to what God is already saying within us. If you are in doubt about something and feel an inexplicable peace, trust. But if there is uneasiness, if something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. God speaks to you through this. He is not a God of confusion, but of order. And when He is in the midst, there is peace, even when there are storms around. If this word spoke to you, I want you to write in the comments, "I choose to trust in God's peace." Declare this as a commitment that you will no longer ignore the signs He gives you. And if you have ever been through a situation where the peace of God guided you to the right decision, share your testimony in the comments. This might help someone who is looking for direction right now. When God uses silence to strengthen your faith, there are times in life when you pray, seek answers, wait for direction, and instead of a clear answer, all you get is silence. The sky seems closed, the doors don't open, and the impression it gives is that God simply decided not to respond. And in this void, in the midst of this unexplained wait, doubt begins to grow. Does He still hear me? Did I forget something? Is my faith not enough? God's silence is one of the most difficult experiences a Christian can face because we are used to associating His presence with movement, with visible signs, with immediate responses. But what if this silence is not abandonment, but rather a strategy? What if God is teaching you to trust Him in a way that can only be learned in the absence of answers? God's silence is never empty. It is loaded with purpose, full of lessons that can only be understood by those who choose to stand firm, even when they don't understand what is happening. Look at Abraham. God promised that he would be the father of a great nation, but after that, years and years passed with no sign of the promise being fulfilled. God's silence did not mean that He had changed His mind, but that Abraham needed to develop a faith that did not depend on the speed of responses. The same thing happened to Joseph. He received a dream that foretold a glorious future, but instead of seeing it happen immediately, his life became a series of hardships. He was sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned, forgotten in prison. God was not speaking, but He was acting. Silence was not absence, it was process, and this is something we need to understand. God does not always respond in the way we expect, because He is not just concerned with our comfort, but with our growth. His silence forces us to look within, to reevaluate our faith, to discover whether we trust in God or just in the blessings He gives us. Many times, we want a faith that frees us from difficulties, but God wants to give us a faith that sustains us within them. If He always responds immediately, without allowing us to go through the process, we never develop spiritual maturity. We never learn to trust when everything seems uncertain. We never discover that He is enough, even when everything around us seems to be in ruins. God's silence teaches us to trust in who He is, not what He can do. When you pray and don't receive an immediate answer, when time passes and nothing changes, you need to decide if you are still going to trust. Will you continue to believe even when you don't feel anything? Will you keep searching even when it seems like there is no progress? Will you remain firm even when all circumstances say it is better to give up? This is real faith. Faith that is not shaken by delay. Faith that does not need external confirmation to know that God is in control. Many give up halfway because they can't deal with the silence. They think that if God isn't speaking, then He doesn't care. But it's exactly the opposite. It is in the silence that He is closest, shaping, working, refining your faith. What you do in these moments defines your level of spiritual growth. Will you run away from God, or will you cling to Him more tightly? Will you allow yourself to be overcome by anxiety, or will you decide to rest in the fact that He is faithful? Silence is a test, not a test for God to discover who you are because He already knows, but for you to discover who you really are in God. Waiting makes you stronger. Every day that passes without an answer is not a day wasted, it is a day of learning. You may not see anything happening, but spiritually there is work being done. Your patience is being developed. Your endurance is being strengthened. Your character is being molded. When you finally receive what you have been asking for, you will be prepared to sustain that blessing because you have gone through the necessary training. There are no shortcuts in the kingdom of God. Waiting time is never wasted time but construction time. Maybe you are in that exact moment right now. Maybe you've prayed for a cure, for a miracle, for a change, and the answer hasn't come yet. Maybe you are wondering if God has forgotten you. But He didn't forget. He sees every tear, every cry, every thought that you can't even put into words. What He is doing now may not be visible, but it is happening. If you could see what God is preparing behind the scenes, you would understand that this waiting is necessary. Today's silence can be tomorrow's testimony. The greatest lesson about God's silence is that He never wastes anything. Every moment of waiting is making you stronger, more mature, more ready for what He has prepared. What you need to do is continue. Keep seeking, keep praying, keep believing. Because at the right time, when your faith has been perfected, the answer will come. And you will look back and understand that God's silence was not a punishment, but a proof of how much He loves you and wants to take you to something greater. If this word spoke to you, write in the comments, "I trust, even in silence." Declare this as an act of faith, as a commitment that you will not give up, you will not stop seeking, you will not let waiting steal your trust in God. And if you have already gone through a time of silence and saw God act afterwards, share your experience in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to keep believing. When God closes one door, He has already prepared another. We can't always understand why certain doors close. You have a dream, a plan, something you've prayed and dedicated yourself to, and suddenly it all falls apart. The opportunity that seemed perfect disappears, the relationship that seemed to be forever comes to an end, the answer you were waiting for doesn't come, and in the midst of this frustration, the inevitable question arises. Why, God? Why did He allow this door to close? If He knew how much this meant to you, why didn't He open the way? But what we don't realize is that when God closes one door, He already has another ready. And this new door is not just a replacement, but something bigger, something we can only see when we stop looking at what was lost. The problem is that we often get so attached to closed doors that we can't see what God is doing. We keep thinking about what went wrong, trying to understand why, looking for answers to something that may never make sense in our eyes. But true faith needs no explanations. True faith trusts that, if God took something out of our path, it is because He already has something better prepared. And this trust cannot be based only on what we see, but on the character of God, on the certainty that He would never leave us without a plan. The Bible shows us this several times. Think about Moses. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace, lived as a prince, with all the advantages and privileges that this brought. But one day, everything changed. After making an impulsive decision and killing an Egyptian, he had to flee to the desert, leaving his entire old life behind. For years he must have wondered if he had missed his chance, if he had wasted the purpose God had for him. But what he didn't know was that that closed door was just preparation for something much bigger. God did not want Moses to be just a prince in Egypt. He wanted Moses to be the liberator of an entire nation. But to do so, he first needed to go through the desert. He needed to be shaped. He needed to learn to trust not in his position, but in the God who had called him. And how often does this happen to us? We want something so much that when it doesn't work out, we feel like everything is over. But what feels like failure may be exactly what God is using to move us towards something greater. When a door closes, our first reaction is often to try to force it open again. We try to revive a relationship that has already ended. We insist on opportunities that are no longer for us. We fight to stay in places where we no longer belong. But God did not call us to live stuck in the past. He called us to move forward. King David also went through this. Before becoming king, he served faithfully in Saul's palace. But at one point, Saul turned against him, and David was forced to flee. For years he lived like a fugitive, hiding, running away without fully understanding why. He could have questioned God. He could have complained. He could have tried to go back to the palace and take matters into his own hands. But he waited. He trusted that if God had anointed him to be king, then the door would open at the right time. And when the moment arrived, David took possession of the throne in a way that no one could stop. If God has closed a door in your life, stop insisting on it. Stop looking back and wondering what could have been different. If it had been for you, if it had been part of God's plan, nothing would have stopped it. What is yours, no one can take. But if He allowed something to be taken away, it is because He has something better. But to get to the best, you first need to release what has already happened. And maybe now you are living exactly that moment. Maybe you missed something you don't understand. Maybe you're trying to find explanations for a situation that doesn't make sense. But instead of focusing on the pain of the closed door, look to the promise of the new door that God is preparing. Trust that even if you don't see it now, He already has it all figured out. The problem is not that God doesn't have something prepared for you. The problem is that we are often so busy mourning what we have lost that we fail to see what He is putting before us. But when you stop looking back, when you decide to trust, when you release what is no longer part of your path, then you are ready for the new. If this word spoke to you, I want you to write in the comments, "I trust what God has for me." Declare this, write this, own this truth. And if you've ever walked through a closed door that you later realized was the best thing that could have happened, share your story in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to find the strength to move forward. God's silence is proof that something greater is coming. There are moments in the journey of faith when it seems that God has completely shut up. You pray, but you feel no answer. You search, but you don't find. You cry out, but the sky looks like bronze. The feeling is of walking in the dark with no clear direction, without even a sign that your prayers are being heard. And in this silence, the mind begins to generate doubts. The heart begins to fill with uncertainty, and the question that echoes within you is inevitable. Why is God silent? But what if this silence is a sign that something much bigger is on the way? What if this period of apparent absence is, in fact, the moment when God is acting most intensely? God's silence is never empty. He doesn't shut up for no reason. And when we look at the Bible, we realize that before every great move of God, there was a period of silence. Before the liberation of the people of Israel, there were 400 years without any prophecy. Before the resurrection, there were 3 days of absolute despair. Before Abraham's promise was fulfilled, there were years of waiting that seemed endless. But in each of these moments, what seemed like inactivity was actually a divine process unfolding behind the scenes. God is never still. He never ignores a sincere prayer. He never closes His ears to those who seek Him. But there are times when He chooses to work in silence to teach us to trust Him, even when we don't see anything happening. And that's the hardest part. Because we are human beings, and we want quick responses, visible signs, immediate confirmations. We want to feel, see, touch. But true faith is not built on what is obvious, but on what requires absolute trust. If God spoke all the time, if every prayer was answered instantly, we would never need to learn to trust. We would never be challenged to grow, to mature, to develop a faith that can withstand the storms. God allows silence because he knows that it is in it that faith is strengthened. What do you do when God doesn't respond right away? Do you give up? Do you retreat? Do you start to doubt? Or do you keep walking, keep praying, keep trusting, even without seeing anything? This is the difference between those who just believe in God and those who truly trust Him. Those who just believe need constant signs, but those who trust move forward, even when everything around them seems contrary. Remember Job. He lost everything: family, wealth, health. And in the midst of pain, I cried out for answers. But God remained silent for a while, and that silence must have been even more painful than anything else Job was facing. But in the end, when God spoke, Job understood that silence was never abandonment. On the contrary, it was a time of learning, of growth, of preparation for something much bigger. What Job received afterwards was double what he had lost. What seemed like a period of absolute despair was, in fact, the transition to a new phase of his life. And maybe that's exactly what God is doing with you right now. Maybe you are looking at your life and seeing only silence. Perhaps you are wondering why certain prayers have not yet been answered. But what you don't realize is that God is at work. He's lining up things you don't see yet. It's preparing people, opportunities, connections. And when the time is right, everything will make sense. But for that to happen, you need to stand firm. Silence cannot be the reason for your faith to weaken. He needs to be the reason for your faith to become even stronger. If God hasn't responded yet, it's because the answer He has for you is being prepared in details that you can't even imagine. And when that answer comes, it will be so much bigger and better than anything you could ever ask or think. Now the question is, what will you do in this quiet time? Will you stop praying because you think God isn't listening? Or will you decide to keep seeking, keep trusting, keep drawing closer to Him? Because silence can be a test, but it can also be an opportunity. You can choose to walk away, let doubt take over, or you can use this time to go even deeper into your walk with God. Because the closer you get to Him, the more prepared you will be for what He is about to do. Maybe right now you're in the middle of this silent phase and can't see anything but emptiness. But I want to remind you of something. Every great testimony comes from a period of waiting. Every great turnaround begins with a period of apparent downtime. God is never late. He is never wrong. If He hasn't responded yet, it's because He is preparing something that goes beyond your understanding. Don't give up now. Don't stop halfway. Today's silence can be tomorrow's miracle. If this word spoke to you, I want you to declare in the comments, I trust even without answers. Write this as an act of faith, as a decision that you won't give up just because you don't yet see what God is doing. And if you have ever gone through a time of silence and then saw God act in extraordinary ways, share your testimony in the comments. Your account may be just what someone needs to keep believing. God is preparing you for something you don't yet see. There are moments in life when everything seems to stand still. You pray, you search, you try, but nothing changes. You look around and see other people moving forward, receiving blessings, achieving what they so desire while you remain in the same place. Frustration begins to grow, discouragement sets in, and the question comes to mind, God, why doesn't anything happen to me? But what you may not realize is that the silence, the waiting, the lack of apparent movement are all part of a much larger process. God is not ignoring you. He is preparing you for something you don't yet see. God's preparation does not always make sense in our eyes. We want quick results. We want to see immediate progress. We want to feel like we are moving forward. But God works in a different way. Before delivering a great blessing, He needs to prepare the ground. Before opening the right door, He needs to shape our hearts. Before taking us to our destination, He needs to ensure that we are ready to sustain what He is going to deliver to us. Because there is no point in arriving at the right place without being prepared to stay there. Look at the story of Joseph. God gave him a great dream, showed that he would have a prominent position, that he would be a leader, that people would bow down to him. But what happened next? Instead of going straight to the position God promised, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused and thrown into prison. To human eyes, it appeared that God's promise had failed. It seemed as if God had forgotten about him. But in reality, God was preparing Joseph. Every experience, every challenge, every difficult moment was building the character he would need to rule Egypt. If God had placed Joseph directly on the throne without first preparing him, he would not have been mature enough to handle the weight of responsibility. The time in the desert, in slavery, in prison, all of this made him learn lessons that would be essential when he reached his destination. And when the time was finally right, Joseph not only received what God promised, but he was ready to deal with it. His preparation was what ensured that he not only achieved the position, but that he knew how to manage it wisely. And the same happens with us. God has something prepared for you, something that is greater than you can imagine. But before you can receive, you need to be prepared. Maybe waiting is teaching you patience. Maybe the challenges are making you stronger. Maybe the lack of answers is teaching you to truly trust God, without just depending on what you see. Everything God allows has a purpose. Nothing is in vain. The problem is that we often resist the process. We want the results without the preparation. We want victory without the battle. We want the harvest without the planting. But that's not how it works. If God gave you everything you are asking for today, would you be ready to sustain it? Would I have the maturity to handle the responsibilities that come with the blessing? Because many people ask God to open a door, but when it opens, they are not prepared to walk through it. God is shaping you. He is removing things from your heart that could keep you from reaching the next level. He is teaching you lessons that you will need in the future. He is strengthening your faith so that when the answer comes, you will be prepared to sustain it. And believe me, when God prepares something, He prepares it completely. He doesn't deliver anything halfway. He doesn't take steps. He doesn't do things anyway. Everything He does has an exact time and exact reason, a perfect purpose. But to live it, you need to trust the process. You need to stop questioning every moment of waiting and start seeing it as training. You need to understand that what seems like a pause is actually an invisible advance. While you wait, God is working. While you pray and don't see answers, He is lining up things that you can't yet see. While you feel like nothing is happening, the sky is in motion setting the stage for what is to come. So instead of asking, "Why hasn't God done it yet?" start asking, "What does God want to teach me at this time?" Instead of complaining about the delay, start preparing for what's coming. If God promised you something, He will fulfill it. But He only delivers at the right time when you are ready to receive. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's because He is still preparing you. Maybe right now you're feeling like you're stuck, that you're being left behind, that your life is going nowhere. But that's not true. You are not stopped. You are in training. And at the right time, everything that God promised you will happen. And when it happens, you'll look back and realize that every second of waiting was worth it. If this word spoke to your heart, write in the comments, "I trust God's process." Declare this as an act of faith, as a decision that you will no longer resist the time of preparation. And if you've ever experienced something like this, where you later realized that God was preparing you for something greater, share your testimony in the comments. Your story may be just what someone needs to keep believing. When God's answer isn't what you expected. God does not always respond in the way we expect. We pray for a solution, and He gives us a process. We ask for a miracle, and He gives us time to wait. We cry out for immediate change, and He teaches us to trust in the right time. This is one of the most difficult realities to accept in spiritual life. God always responds, but not always in the way we imagine. And when this happens, when the answer we receive is not what we wanted, many become frustrated, many give up, many begin to question the goodness of God. But what if the unexpected answer is actually deliverance? What if what you see as a negative is actually God protecting you from something you can't see? Our vision is often limited. We ask for something because we believe it is best for us, but we don't have the full perspective. God, on the other hand, sees what lies beyond. He sees what we cannot. He knows where each path ends. He knows which doors will lead us to our purpose and which will take us away from it. And therefore He does not respond based on our will, but based on what is necessary to fulfill His purpose in our lives. This means that not every prayer will be answered with a yes. Sometimes God will say no. Other times He will say wait. And our reaction to this reveals how much we truly trust Him. Look at Paul's life. He was a man of faith, someone who dedicated his life to the gospel, who faced persecution, imprisonment, shipwreck, and still remained faithful. But there was a time when he asked God for something and didn't receive the answer he wanted. He prayed 3 times for God to remove a thorn in his flesh, something that bothered him deeply. But instead of delivering him from that, God responded, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul wanted to be free from that situation, but God wanted him to learn to depend even more on his grace. What seemed like a frustrating response was actually a gift, because it was through that weakness that Paul experienced a deeper level of God's presence. And how many times has this happened to us? We ask God to remove something, but He allows us to continue facing it. We pray for a problem to go away, but He gives us the strength to endure it rather than simply eliminate it. This does not mean that He does not love us. On the contrary, it means He knows exactly what we need to grow. Because the truth is, if everything were easy, we would never learn to truly trust. If God said yes to our every request, we wouldn't need faith. We would not need to learn to depend on His will and not ours. But there are times when God's answer seems even more difficult to accept. Moments when we pray for something good, something fair, something we see no reason to deny, and still, the answer doesn't come. We ask for someone's healing and instead we watch them go. We ask for an open door and instead we see more doors closing. We ask God to free us from pain, but instead we go through the valley of affliction. And in those moments when nothing makes sense, when everything inside us wants to ask God, why? That's when our faith is most challenged. This is exactly what happened to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. That night He prayed to the Father saying, "If possible, let this cup pass from me." He knew what He was about to face. He knew the cross was before Him. He knew the pain that would come. And, humanly speaking, He asked not to go through that. But soon after, He completed the prayer with the most powerful words we can say, "Not my will, but yours, be done." That's the point. Trusting God is not just asking for what we want, but accepting what He gives us even when we don't understand. Maybe today you're dealing with a response you didn't expect. Maybe you prayed for something and God gave you a completely different path. And you may be frustrated, you may be feeling like He hasn't heard you. But I want to remind you of something. If God responded differently than you wanted, it's because He has something much greater than what you asked for. Something you will only understand later. Something that one day you will look back and be grateful for. So instead of fighting God's answer, embrace it. Instead of dwelling on something He has already said no to, trust that He has a better prepared yes. Instead of asking yourself, why did this happen? Ask, what does God want to teach me through this? The key to living in peace is not having all the answers, but trusting that even when the answers are not what we expected, God is still in control. If this word spoke to your heart, Write in the comments, "I trust God's answer." Declare this as an act of surrender, as a decision that you will no longer fight against what He has already determined. And if you've ever gone through a moment when God's answer wasn't what you wanted, but then you understood that it was best for you, share your story in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to keep trusting. God uses difficulties to reveal His true strength. We don't always realize how strong we are until life puts us in situations that require endurance, faith, and perseverance. We often pray asking God to strengthen us, but we forget that strength does not come from the absence of challenges, but from the ability to overcome them. God does not make us strong by removing obstacles from the path, but by teaching us to face them. Every battle you face, every moment of uncertainty, every pain you endure is molding a warrior within you, someone who does not bend in the face of adversity, someone who learns to trust God even when everything seems contrary. But what to do when the storm seems to have no end? How to find purpose in the midst of pain? Look at the greatest biblical characters. None of them had an easy path. Moses was rejected and spent years in the desert before becoming the leader of Israel. David was anointed king, but spent years running from Saul before taking the throne. Paul suffered persecution, shipwrecks, prisons, and still continued to preach the gospel. And Jesus himself, the Son of God, was not exempt from suffering. He faced betrayal, humiliation, pain, and death on the cross. But in each of these stories, we see an undeniable truth. God not only allowed the hardships, but used each of them to prepare these people for something greater. The big question is how you choose to react to difficult times. You can allow pain to paralyze you, fear to stop you from moving forward, difficulties to keep you from God. Or you can use each challenge as a stepping stone to grow, learn, and become stronger. The way you face challenges determines your destiny. There are people who go through struggles and come out more bitter, more closed, full of resentment. But there are those who come out wiser, more mature, more full of faith. The difference between these two reactions is not in the intensity of the problem, but in the way each person chose to deal with it. Maybe you are going through a moment where you feel like you no longer have the strength. Maybe you're facing something that seems too big to bear, but I want to remind you of something. Within you there is more strength than you imagine. The Bible tells us that God's power is made perfect in weakness. This means that it is precisely in the moments when you think you can no longer do it that God enters the scene. When you reach your limit, when you feel like you have nowhere left to run, when all your strategies fail, that's when He manifests His power. God doesn't need you to be strong all the time, He just needs you to trust. Life will not always follow the script you imagined. Sometimes things will go wrong. Sometimes you will be betrayed, disappointed, hurt. Sometimes you will have to deal with losses that you cannot explain. But none of this means that God has abandoned you. On the contrary, it means that He is shaping you. Gold is refined in fire. Diamonds only form under extreme pressure. The strongest trees are those that face the strongest winds. So if you're going through a difficult process right now, don't see it as a punishment. See it as a construction. God is making you stronger, more resilient, more prepared for what lies ahead. And the most incredible thing is that what seems unbearable today will one day become your testimony. What makes you cry today will be your greatest proof that God has never abandoned you. And you might look back and say, if I went through that, I can face anything. Because the truth is that the difficulty you face now is not the end of you. She is just part of the process. You are not alone in this. God is with you in every detail, in every tear, in every moment when you thought about giving up. And He already has the exit prepared. But first, He wants to teach you to trust. He wants you to see that your strength does not come from circumstances, but from your faith. Now stop and think. How many times have you faced something that you thought you couldn't overcome, but you did? How many times has God supported you when you thought it was impossible to move forward? If He has done it before, why wouldn't He do it now? If He has already delivered you in the past, why would He leave you now? God does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If you trust Him, if you decide not to give up, you will see that this phase that seems too difficult will be just another chapter in your story of victory. If this word spoke to you, I want you to write in the comments, God is making me stronger. Declare this as an act of faith, as a decision that you will not let difficulty stop you. And if you've ever been through a difficult time and seen God strengthen you through it, share your story in the comments. Someone may need exactly that encouragement to continue. The purpose behind the pain you face, pain never comes without a reason. Every tear shed, every battle fought, every moment of suffering you have ever faced carries within it a greater purpose than you can imagine. But the big question is, can you see beyond the pain? Can you look at your struggle and believe that there is something being built inside you? Because the truth is that nothing God allows in your life is in vain. No wound, no loss, no disappointment happens without a reason. And if you learn to look at difficulties from this perspective, your life will never be the same. The problem is that when we are suffering, all we can see is the immediate impact of the pain. We ask ourselves why this is happening. We look for answers. We want a quick way out. But God sees beyond. He sees what this pain is forming inside of you. He knows there is a purpose for every situation we face. Think about the story of Joseph. He was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a well, sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned. For years he lived in a cycle of pain and injustice. But each of these experiences was shaping the man he needed to become to fulfill his calling. If Joseph had remained trapped by the trauma of the past, he would never have become the governor of Egypt. But he chose to trust that there was something bigger behind it all. And that choice is yours too. You can decide to let the pain define you, or you can decide to use it as fuel to become stronger. You can hold on to what you've lost, or you can believe that God is preparing you for something greater. Pain never has the last word. What seems like the end today may just be the beginning of a new cycle in your life. The question is, how will you react? Will you allow yourself to wallow in suffering, or will you look forward and trust that God is using even this difficult time to take you to a higher level? It's hard to understand this when we're in the middle of the storm. When the pain is still throbbing, when the heart is still broken, when the questions are still unanswered. But God never wastes suffering. He uses every part of your story to transform you, to strengthen you, to teach you something that you could only learn by going through this process. Gold only becomes pure after passing through fire. The diamond is only formed after a lot of pressure. And you will only become what God called you to be after crossing this desert. David spent years on the run before becoming king. Moses spent decades in the desert before being called to free Israel. Job lost everything before being restored twice as much. Each of these stories teaches us that God's purpose always goes through a process of preparation. What may seem like a pointless phase of pain can actually be a time of training. But the problem is that most of the time we resist the process. We want quick answers. We want the pain to go away soon. We want everything to be resolved in our time. But God does not work in our haste. He works in perfect time. And if you're hurting right now, if you feel like you're in the middle of an endless desert, I want you to know something. God is still in control. Even when it seems like everything is against you, He is still writing your story. And one day you will look back and understand that this phase was essential to prepare you for what comes next. What hurts today, tomorrow will be testimony. What makes you cry today, tomorrow will be a reason for gratitude. What seems unfair today will be proof tomorrow that God has never lost control of your life. But to live this, you need to trust. You need to stop wondering, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what does God want to teach me with this? Because this shift in perspective can completely transform your journey. When you understand that each pain carries a lesson, that each tear is an investment in your growth, that each difficult phase is a step towards something greater, then pain loses its power to paralyze you. If this word spoke to your heart, write in the comments, "My pain has a purpose." Declare this as an act of faith, as a commitment that you will not let pain define your story. And if you've ever gone through a difficult time and then saw God transform it into something greater, share your experience in the comments. Your testimony may be just what someone needs to keep believing. If you've made it this far, it means this message has touched your heart in some way. And we want to know, how did this word speak to you? What did God minister to your spirit through this video? Write in the comments, "I felt God's voice in this video," and share your testimony, because your experience can strengthen the faith of someone who also needs this word today. Each comment is a sign that God is acting, that this message is reaching lives and fulfilling the purpose for which it was sent. And if this video blessed you, don't keep it to yourself. Support this mission so that more people can be reached. Leave your like, because this helps this message reach more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content that can transform your walk with God. And of course, share this video with someone who needs to hear this word today. Before you leave, remember that God is always speaking. Sometimes He speaks through His word, sometimes through people, sometimes through silence. But He always has something to teach us. And if you felt God speak to you today, keep seeking, keep trusting, keep walking by faith. And now, I want to invite you to continue this journey with me. The next video is already on the final screen, and in it there is a powerful message waiting for you. Don't miss what God wants to reveal to you. May the Lord bless your life in a supernatural way. May this word continue to echo in your heart, and may the peace of God accompany you in every step of your journey. See you in the next video.